Hey, it's Gruey, and I'm here today to help you with your 423 classwork. So, ladies and gentlemen, today for your classwork, you needed to read pages 14 through 17 of Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. You're also going to answer 6 questions. Now, if you're working with the PDF, you are going to look at the page numbers. The page numbers are in the parentheses. If you are working with the Google Doc, you're going to work with the paragraph number instead, which is written right after the question mark. So, without further ado, let's get into our classwork. Our first question asks us, what is Coates afraid of? So, I'm going to go to the first paragraph, also right at the start of page 14. So, in this first paragraph, Coates says, I am afraid. I feel the fear most acutely whenever you leave me. He also talks on page 15. I know that's not in the question. He talks on page 15 and in paragraph 5 about how his father had a similar fear that he had. And then we learn on page 16 that everyone had lost a child, right? So if there's a loss of a child, that means someone's also losing a sibling or a cousin or a friend. So essentially, Coates' fear is losing his loved ones, right? Coates' fear is losing his loved ones. If I were using evidence to support that, I would probably go with the sentence that says, I am afraid in paragraph 1, or I feel the fear most acutely whenever you leave me, because we know Coates loves his son. Our second question asks, why is Coates' fear heightened by having a son? Well, if you're a parent and you care about your child, you want to see them succeed and you want to protect them. Coates feels this fear most acutely, meaning intensely, whenever his son leaves him. So, whenever his son is gone, because he wants to protect his son. So, his fear is heightened by having a son because he now has someone that he wants to protect, but is afraid he won't be able to protect always. That's my interpretation of it. If you agree, disagree, that's fine. Please use evidence just like I am to support your findings and your thoughts. Our third question today asks you all, what does Coates see as signs of fear in others? This comes from pages 14 through 15, which means it comes from paragraphs 2 through 4. All right, paragraphs 2 through 4. So I'm going to start by looking at the evidence and pointing out some things. At the beginning of paragraph 2, he says that there was fear in the extravagant boys of his neighborhood because they would wear their armor against the world, and their armor included large rings, medallions, big puffy coats, full-length, full-collared leather, and he also says he noticed this fear in their practiced bop, their slouching denim. So he saw fear in the boys in his neighborhood, and the signs of their fear was how they dressed. They dressed in a way to try to look as if they were in control, like Coates says, but their appearance was kind of like armor. He also, in paragraph 3, he says he saw fear in their customs of war. And so the fear was in the ritual to a street fight, the bylaws and codes that, in their very need, attested to all the vulnerability of the black teenage bodies. So here, another sign of fear that Coates says he witnessed were the bylaws to street fights. So he saw these two shirtless boys circle each other close and then buck shoulders. So the circling, the bucking at each other, those are all things that occur before the fight. And he saw them as signs of fear, meaning that they didn't actually want to get into those fights. They were afraid of what might happen in those fights. Now, let's check out paragraph 4. Another sign of fear that Coates saw in others was the music that they listened to. So he says that they were the boys who stood out on Garrison and Liberty up on Park Heights, and they loved this music because it told them, against all evidence and odds, that they were masters of their own lives. Right before that, Coates describes the music as being full of grand boast and bluster. So in this music, much like in the outfits. The music was used to put up a front to show that there was no fear, to show that they had control, but really Coates views those things as a sign of them showing their fear or of having fear. Finally, in paragraph 4, he also says that he saw it in girls in his neighborhood as well. And their signs of fear came from their loud laughter, in their gilded bamboo earrings that announced their names thrice over, in their brutal language and hard gaze, right? So all of these things that are done to try to make you look stronger or tougher or more in control, Coates saw those as signs of fear in others because they're trying to show what they want to express or what they want to feel, even though they don't. So, now let's move on to question 4. How did fear affect Coates' parents? This is going to be seen in paragraphs 5 and 6, which means that last half of page 15 and all of page 16. You can focus on either his mom or his dad here, but I'm going to talk about both. Coates starts by talking about his father. He says his father knew that his father's father was, Coates says, and I knew that my father's father was dead, and that my uncle Oscar was dead, and that my uncle David was dead, and that each of these instances was unnatural, meaning that their lives were cut short, not by a medical event, but by something else, most likely meaning someone. So, Coates' father has experienced a lot of loss. So Coates' father himself also has that fear of losing his son, right? I get to see there where the fear comes from. Now let's see how that fear affects Coates' father. At the bottom of 15, in the middle of paragraph 5, he says, my father was so very afraid. I felt it in the sting of his black leather belt, which he applied with more anxiety than anger. My father, who beat me as if someone might steal me away, because that is, top of 16, exactly what was happening all around us. So for Coates' father, fear causes him to be violent or to beat his son when necessary, right? Fear causes him to do that. On page 16, we hear a story about what happened to Coates' mother. So Coates says that when his mother was 16 years old, someone came and knocked on the door, right? Let's see what happens with that instance. He writes, she beat your grandmother terrifically one last time so that she might remember how easily she could lose her body. Ma never forgot. I remember her clutching my small hand tightly as we crossed the street. She would tell me that if I ever let go and were killed by an onrushing car, she would beat me back to life. So again, here, this fear of losing someone caused Coates' mother to be beaten by her grandmother, right? Her grandmother didn't want to lose her, so she beat her to teach her a lesson. And Coates' mother likewise tells him the same thing. She tells him, if I ever lose you, I will beat you. But she says it by saying if he were killed by an onrushing car, she would beat him back to life. Also, towards the middle of paragraph 6, I know it's a long paragraph, Coates talks about the time that he snuck away from his parents as a small kid to go play on a playground. And he says that when they found me, Dad did what every parent I knew would have done. He reached for his belt. So again, when his parents are afraid because he's run off and they don't know where he is or what has happened to him or what he's doing, they react with violence. So, doesn't really matter which parent you pick, fear really causes them to react with violence or be violent with Coates himself. Let's move on to question 5, shall we? So, question 5 asks, according to Coates, how does fear cause violence? Well, I know we've started to see it with his parents, right? They're afraid of losing their child, just like their families were afraid of losing them. So violence is the means that they're using to try to teach their children. On page 17, Coates continues talking about this idea, right? The idea of violence coming from that. At the bottom of 16 to the top of 17. Coates says, all I know is the violence rose from the fear like smoke from a fire. So Coates is definitely saying there that fear causes violence. But our question asks, how? right? So let's keep reading. On 17, he says, "What I know is that fathers who slammed their teenage boys for sass would then release them to the streets where their boys employed and were subject to the same justice. And I knew mothers who belted their girls, but the belt could not save these girls from drug dealers twice their age. We, the children, employed our darkest humor to cope." So, fear causes violence because these parents don't want to lose their children, so they use violence on their children. And then when they are on the streets, as Coates puts it, or out in the world, they use that violence with each other to try to signify, I guess it seems like Coates is saying, to try to signify that they don't want to lose those people. Their darkest humor, as Coates goes on to describe, is they make fun of each other. So they're still using pain against each other. They're making fun of their peers whose parents beat them, right? He says they would crack jokes on the boy whose mother wore him out with a beating in front of his entire 5th grade class. So they take this fear of their parents and turn it into a type of verbal violence against each other as well. So hopefully that helped you all with question 5. We are now on to our last and final question. For this one, it says, according to Coates, how does violence connect to the black body? Use the whole reading. So, to me, where this stems from comes from something that he introduced on page 14 in paragraph 2. It's towards the end of paragraph 2. Coates says, I think back on those boys now and all I see is fear. And all I see is them girding themselves, meaning securing themselves or protecting themselves against the ghosts of the bad old days when the Mississippi mob gathered round their grandfathers so that the branches of the black body might be torched, then cut away. So, in my opinion, it comes back to this idea, this violence started as due to racism, right? He's talking about the ghosts of the past. That could be a reference to the Klan because of their origins. It could also just be a reference to lynch mobs and the Jim Crow era and the deep segregation and the deep racism of the South. For a very long time, many African Americans in certain parts of the South, especially in other parts of this nation, were treated terribly. There was the fear that at any point in time a lynch mob could form, or you could be accused for something that you did not do by a white, and you would have an all-white jury convict you just because of your skin color. And so violence connects back to this idea of the black body because it, in my personal opinion, what Coates is saying is this violence that comes from the fear of losing one another. It all connects back to that idea of racism. To me, that's how I interpret this question. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found this video helpful. This has been my TED Talk. If you have questions, please reach out. You guys know how to get a hold of me. And as always, make good choices. All right, until next time.